Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the 7 studio albums made by the Roger Hodgson era Supertramp. They're a funny old band, Supertramp, aren't they? I mean, you know, you have these lists and pub banter and all these discussions about music, and I think they rarely get a look in. They just seem to get overlooked a little bit. Were they a rock band? Were they a pop band? Were they a prog band? They seem to sort of fall between the cracks. I think the truth is that they were all three. They formed in London in 1969 with Rick Davis, a sort of proggy jazzy piano player, and Roger Hodgson, a sort of more pop-leaning bass player. Got together with guitarist Richard Palmer and bass player Robert Miller on drums. Famously got their name from the novel The Autobiography of a Supertramp by William Henry Davis, and they were oddly bankrolled by a Dutch millionaire in the early days. Gosh, I wish my bands had been bankrolled by a Dutch millionaire. They made 7 albums for A&M before Roger Hodgson inevitably left to pursue a solo career. The band soldiered on, made a few records, but most people would agree that the real glory days were in the past by then. As I said, they seem to get overlooked in the sort of discussion about great English bands, and the dynamic was always between Roger Hodgson's pop leanings and Rick Davis's more proggy jazzy leanings, and that created a lot of conflict throughout their entire career, which we'll talk about as we go along. But I think their best stuff is sublime. I think their worst stuff is quite the opposite, which brings us to the list. And let's start at their least appealing album in 7th place from 1971, their second album, Indelibly Stamped. Now, if ever you need an album cover to give you an indication of how bad a record is, this is it. This album sold even less than their debut, which is saying something, even though it had a much more sort of straightforward rock sound. There had been lineup changes. Palmer and Miller had left by this second album, to be replaced by a couple of guys who were only around for this record. We don't really need to mention them. Hodgson and Davis by now were firmly in control of the songwriting. They hadn't been on the first record. But the album just didn't catch fire with anybody at all, and the Dutch millionaire stopped bankrolling them. Their sugar daddy left after this record. Roger Hodgson admits they were still scrabbling around to find a sound and a direction. And it's hard to pick any good tracks on this record at all. There's weird instrumentation. Well, just inappropriate. It doesn't feel right at all. It really feels like they just don't know what they're doing as a band and where they should be going. There's some sort of odd noodly jamming towards the end of this record. Like I said, the cover says it all, and very little, if any of it, sticks in the memory, and if it does, it's for all the wrong reasons. In 6th place from 1982, their 7th and final album with Roger Hodgson, Famous Last Words. So the tensions between Hodgson and Davis eventually, exploded, and Roger Hodgson decided it was time to go off and form a solo career, but not before leaving us with this rather bland final gift. By this stage, the two of them were sort of living in different parts of the world, to the point where they even recorded their parts in their own home studios. And as a result, this whole record just, it never pulls together. It feels really skew-whiff. There's absolutely there's no vision here at all. I think they both had very different ideas of what they wanted it to be. Roger Hodgson has already said by this point the life had really gone out of the band, and it's bland. Didn't stop it selling 500,000 copies and going top 10. The most famous track, I think, is probably It's Raining Again, which I'm sure some of you could hum and may have heard on the radio. Just feels very, very lightweight after the record that came before it, Breakfast in America. That promised so much more, but if anybody understood anything about the dynamic in the band, that was never going to happen. We were never going to get much more. In 5th place, their 4th album from 1975, Crisis, What Crisis. The band had had a breakthrough with Crime of the Century, the album just before this. So this was their first album to be recorded in the USA, and they were on tour when Roger Hodgson hurt his hand and they couldn't play live. So there was nothing left to do but go into the studio and try and make a record. But they weren't ready. They just didn't have the songs. A lot of the songs on here are leftovers that they didn't put on Crime of the Century, and that's never a good sign. So the album does feel rushed. It feels really half-baked, really unformed, and there's no centerpiece to this record. We all like a record with a heart and a soul and a centerpiece. Sister Moonshine's a good song, I think, and what else? Ain't Nobody, but Me is. I think those are the two standouts. But as I said, the whole is very disjointed. Roger Hodgson didn't like it, and it did get a bit of a panning in the press. From 1977, their fifth album, sorry, which is in fourth place, is Even in the Quietest Moments. I think this is where we start getting to the real meat of the Supertramp sandwich. This album was self-produced in Colorado. It was engineered by Peter Henderson, who went on to do some work with Rush, very well regarded. And this album really put the band back on track after Crisis What Crisis. They really needed it to prove that Crime of the Century, their second album, was no fluke. And it had hits. Give a Little Bit. Sorry, Crime of the Century was their third album, not their second album. Sorry, take that back. This album had hits. Give a Little Bit, Fool's Overture. There are quite a few highlights on this record. From Now On, the title track. It was their first album to sell 500,000 copies. And you know, I think there's something lovely about this record. Really, there's something very unpretentious about Supertramp. I think for a proggy band, there's a kind of innocence they have compared to some of their sort of more ambitious and indulgent prog rock pals. There's a sort of real lack of a need to show off, for want of a better phrase. It's about the songs, and that's not always the case with prog. If indeed you think Supertramp are prog. But we can discuss that in the comments later. Now in third place, their first album from 1970, Supertramp. Now, Supertramp was having so little success that this album actually wasn't released in the States until 1977, and it has been released under the name of Now and Then. But it's Supertramp. It's their debut album. All the lyrics on this record were by guitarist Richard Palmer, because Rick Davis and Roger Hodgson just didn't want to do it. They didn't feel up to it. They decided to record this album through a series of nighttime sessions, because they thought that's when they'd capture the magic. And you know what? I really think they did. I bloody love this album. I don't know why. Sometimes an album just sort of just gets hold of you, and the sound of it and the feel of it, the atmosphere of it, just you find really, really alluring. And this is absolutely one of those records for me. All the music is by Rick and Roger together, which is not something that always happened. And Roger Hodgson says that he did feel this album had a really good mood to it, and I absolutely agree with him. People never rate it, but do go and check it out. There's something very, very lovely and gentle and groovy about it. It gets under my skin, and I find it quite intoxicating. Eventually, all the songs from this album got dropped from their live shows, but it's trippy and it's proggy and it has a real personality to it. I like all the songs on this record, so I don't want to single one out. Just go and listen to the whole thing and sort of get lost in the sort of crazy trippy sort of vibe of it. You won't regret it. It's great. In second place, from 1974, their third album, Crime of the Century. Now, crucially, this is where the classic lineup begins. You've got Bob Siebenberg coming in on drums, Dougie Thompson on bass, and John Anthony Helliwell comes in on saxophone. And this is the real start of the Supertramp sound. And what a leap it is. And this album was a real commercial breakthrough as well. Because the band's found its sound, and also beautifully produced, I might add, by Ken Scott, who many of you will know worked with Bowie in the early days. But the arrangements are suddenly, just slicker and more sophisticated. School, Bloody Well Right, Dreamer, Rudy. Every song on this record hits the mark. I'm sure you know some of those songs. Deservedly went top 10 in the UK. It got to number 4, went top 40 in the USA, and critics were on board for the first time with Supertramp as well. They liked it, to the point where Rolling Stone put it in its top 50 prog albums of all time. I think if you ask a lot of Supertramp diehards, they're going to tell you this is their favourite album. But for me, there is one that bettered it. And if you don't know by now, it is their sixth album from 1979, Breakfast in America. This is their most famous and most successful album. Had 4 chart hits that you'll still hear on the radio today. Breakfast in America, Logical Song, Goodbye Stranger, Take the Long Way Home. It was recorded in LA, and you can hear it. You can hear the sunshine all over the record. Despite the previous growing tensions between Hodgson and Davis, they've both said many times that this was actually a really, really happy time. It was a fun time. And you can hear it. There's a real lightness of touch in the deceptively complex songs on this record. The production's really sort of crisp and crystal clear. And it got its just rewards. It won 2 Grammys. It sold 4 million copies, by far and away their best-selling album. Classic Rock once rated it the 69th greatest British album of all time. And I think it's a joy. I really do. I when I want an album to sort of lift me up and just make me feel good and feel chilled and just bring some sunshine into the world or the room, then this is absolutely one of my go-to records. So if you don't know it, go and check it out. I think, it rarely makes, all-time greatest hits lists. And I find that baffling. Maybe I'll start a campaign to get Supertramp back on the rock and roll map properly. But there you go. That is my list of the Supertramp albums. I really don't know what you think about Supertramp. I'd love to know. So do let me tell me in the comments below, and let's talk about them a little bit. If you're new to Supertramp, I think the first 4, the top 4 records here are really good. The top 2 are essential, really. And then, if you want to trust my judgment, go and have a listen to their first album, Supertramp. The other albums you don't really need to get into. They did soldier on, as I said earlier, with Rick Davis. They made a few more records, getting Brother, the best of which was the next one, Brother Where You Bound, which has some pretty good songs on it. And then after that, it really started becoming much less interesting. But look, there you go. A sort of fairly quick one this week after all my prattling away on the double albums last week. I hope you enjoyed it. I would love to hear what you think about Supertramp in the comments below. But I will see you again very soon for another Rock Records Reviewed. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.